Welcome everyone, my name is Rebeka Karajos and my presentation is about the variation in the acceptability of overt subjects in Hungarian controlled clauses. Here you can see the structure of the presentation. Let me start my presentation with the definition of control. We are talking about control constructions when the subject of the embedded infinitival clause is referentially bound to an argument of the matrix clause. So, for example, here in sentence 1, Lucy tried to talk loudly to everyone. Here the reference of the covered subject is controlled by the matrix subject Lucy. In this way we know that Lucy is the one who tried to talk loudly to everyone. In control constructions, the subjects in the embedded clauses are usually covered, but there are special cases. Szabolcsy was the one who discovered that in Hungarian it's possible to have an overt subject in the infinitival clause as well, as you can see in sentence 2, nem akarok csak én tanulni. Szabolcsy used this method, placing the csak before the overt subject, to test and show that the subject belongs to the infinitival clause, because the csak gives focus to the subject, and in Hungarian, focused elements must stand in the immediately preverbal position. In the survey, I also used this method to test and show that the subject belongs to the infinitival clause. There are several studies about Hungarian control constructions with overt subjects in their infinitival clauses, but the acceptability of these kinds of control sentences hasn't been systematically investigated. So the goal of my research is to empirically investigate the influence of the semantic nature of the predicate and the lexical versus pronominal nature of the DP. Regarding the semantic nature of the predicate, I focused on the exhaustive partial distinction, which I will talk about in the next section in more details. I also wanted to examine the possible dialectal preferences and to study the possible theoretical consequences as well. Now let me present some details from the previous literature. Hungarian control constructions with overt subjects in their infinitival clauses have been examined in several studies, but here in the presentation I focus on the works of Szabolcsy, Bartos and Széchenyi. These works are mainly concerned with the proper analysis of the construction. In 3a you can see the pro approach illustrated, where the covered subject is a special null pronoun with no phonological content, while in contrast, according to the movement theory of control, the covered subject is a copy of a moved element that is deleted in the phonological component, but is still available for interpretation at the logical form. Although these studies are mainly concerned with the proper analysis, they also comment on the acceptability. Szabolcsy suggests that regarding acceptability, the lexical versus pronominal nature of the DP is genuine. The pronominal DP is acceptable for her, like the sentence you can see in 4, utálok csak én dolgozni, and Szabolcsy suggests that the pro approach is the correct analysis. In contrast with Szabolcsy's pro approach, Bartos proposed an alternative analysis based on the movement theory of control. He suggests that the construction can be treated as a backward control, where the lower copy is the pronounced element and the higher copy is the covered subject. Bartos suggests that in Hungarian, the overtness in the infinitival clause is due to emphasis, and when a lower copy is under emphasis, it must be partially pronounced, and in Hungarian, this partial pronunciation takes place by pronouncing a personal pronoun with the pronominal features of the copy. In this way, in Bartos's backward control analysis, only personal pronouns are available as the subject of the embedded clause. Széchenyi extends Bartos's argument and suggests that for a set of speakers, lexical DPs are also available in the infinitival clause, like nem akarnak csak a fiúk büntetést kapni. And Széchenyi supports the copy theory approach. So the main motivation behind the examination of the lex-pron factor is that the analyses seem to divide here, as constructions with pronominal DPs can be analyzed with both the pro and the movement approaches, while constructions with lexical DPs can only be analyzed with Széchenyi's movement approach. And it's an empirical question as well, as we can see here. Széchenyi suggests that lexical DPs in such constructions are maybe available only for a restricted set of speakers. And now let me say a few words about the partial exhaustive distinction. Landau was the one who made a distinction between exhaustive control predicates and partial control predicates, and he also proposed different analyses to these constructions, namely the logophoric versus predicative control. In sentence 7 and 8, you can see the distinction illustrated. In sentence 7, John tried together at 6. Here, the predicate try is an exhaustive control predicate, so the reference of the controller exhaustively corresponds with the reference of the controlled element. In this way, the sentence has a semantic problem because it's impossible to gather alone. In contrast, in the case of sentence 8, John wanted together at 6. Here, the predicate want is a partial control predicate, so the reference of the controlled element doesn't have to correspond exhaustively to the reference of the controller. So here, there are other potential participants of the activity. Bartos mentions the difference between exhaustive control predicates and partial control predicates in Hungarian, and he finds both equally acceptable, but he also mentions that there is maybe a conceptualization problem with exhaustive control constructions containing emphasis on the lower copy, because in the case of exhaustive control predicates, the emphasis on the lower copy may sound trivial since there are no other participants to whom the reference of the matrix subject can be interpreted to. But speakers seem to solve the conceptualization question without any problem, according to Bartos. So the main motivation behind the examination of the X part factor is in the different analyses proposed by Landau and in the possible semantic constraints mentioned by Bartos, and it's also an empirical question because based on my own intuitions I find the acceptability of exhaustive control predicates in such constructions rather questionable. When creating the survey, I expected that lexical DPs will be less acceptable than pronominal DPs, and I also expected that exhaustive control predicates will be less acceptable than partial control predicates. I used the Google form to collect data, and there were 4 construction types given to the speakers with 16 target sentences and 16 fillers. In the survey, speakers had to decide on a 1 to 7 scale how natural the structures sound to them, and the participants had to choose their counties according to where they spent their childhood. And here you can see the structures that I used. The exhaustive control predicate plus lexical DP structure, like megpróbáltak csak a fiúk bejutni. The exhaustive control predicate plus pronominal DP structure, like megpróbáltam csak én táncolni. The partial control predicate plus lexical DP structure, like törekedtek csak a fiúk edzeni. And the partial control predicate plus pronominal DP structure, like utáltam csak én tanulni. And here you can see the predicates that I used. Exhaustive control predicates like megpróbál, elfelejt and méltóztat, and partial control predicates like utál, törekszik and fél. 87 native speakers filled out the form, and there was a huge disproportion between the counties. In this table you can see the number of the participants from each county, and you can see that, for example, from Hajdú-Bihar there were 49 speakers who filled out the form, but there was only 1 speaker, for example, from Heves, Csongrád, Orvas counties. And the results? The structure with part pron sounded the most natural to the native speakers. This structure got 4.82 points on average. The structure with X pron sounded the second most natural with 3.74 points. The third most natural structure was the one with X-Lex with 3.66 points. And the least natural structure was the one with part Lex with 3.37 points. In this figure you can see the averages of the points given to each construction type. Here you can see that the part-pron structure was the most natural according to the speakers, and the part-like structure was the least natural according to them, while in the case of the X-lax and the X-prone structure, these constructions got nearly the same points. I have managed to create statistics from the data, and it shows that both the subject type factor and the control predicate type was able to create significant differences in the acceptability of the structures. You can see the correlation illustrated here. It shows that the part-prone structure got significantly higher points than all the other structures. In the case of the X-prone and the X-lax structures, there was no significant difference, and the part-lax structure got significantly lower points than all the other structures. The interaction between the two factors is also significant. This figure shows that in the case of exhaustive control predicates, the nature of the DP doesn't seem to influence the acceptability significantly, while in the case of partial control predicates, the acceptance of the pronominal DP is significantly higher than the acceptance of the lexical DP. The results also show that in the case of lexical DP structures, the exhaustive control predicates seem to be a little more acceptable than partial control predicates, while in constructions with pronominal DPs, the acceptability of partial control predicates seem to be significantly higher than the acceptability of exhaustive control predicates. As I mentioned, I wanted to examine the county factor as well to investigate the possible dialectal preferences, but the proportion between the participants from each county was uneven, so I wasn't able to make relevant comparisons with respect to the whole country and in this way study these preferences. In other words, the county factor wasn't able to make significant differences in the acceptability. However, I've made an interesting comparison between the speakers of Hajdú-Bihar County and the speakers of all the other counties together, and it shows that speakers from Hajdú-Bihar County seem to reject pronominal DPs in the constructions more easily than speakers from every other county in their judgments. In this table, you can see the possible reasons of the judgments and the possible analysis of the constructions. The first structure was the part-prone construction. The most outstanding difference was between this structure and all the other structures. And the reason behind this is probably that this is the default and easiest to access for the speakers. Because of the partial control predicate, there is no possible conceptualization problem here. And because of the pronominal DP, all three approaches are available. In the case of the second structure, the X-prone construction, it got significantly lower points. So here, the nature of the control predicate seemed to make a notable difference, and the exhaustive partial distinction is based on semantic aspects, so these aspects seem to make relevant differences in the judgment as well. In the case of the third structure, there was no significant difference between the second and the third constructions, but here syntactic aspects also changed, and this change has consequences in the analysis as well. And in the case of the fourth structure, this was the least natural construction according to the speakers, and it's interesting that the most acceptable was also a construction with a partial control predicate. So here the change of the pronominal DP to lexical DP seemed to create the most significant difference, but only in constructions with a partial control predicate. Regarding the analysis of the constructions, we can see that constructions with pronominal DPs can be analyzed with all three approaches, while constructions with lexical DPs can only be analyzed with the Széchenyi's movement approach. And here I have to point out that the data and the results presented here are presented rather from a statistical point of view. So the differences between the constructions are relevant statistically. But from a linguistic perspective, I would say that the relevant difference is between the first structure and the other structures. As I mentioned, the proportion of the speakers from the counties was really uneven, and the statistics has shown that, for example, speakers from Hajdú-Bihar seem to reject constructions with pronominal DPs more easily than speakers from other counties. This suggests that maybe a bigger sample size or more participants from other counties could show a different order in the places of the second, the third, and the fourth structures. So here I think the point is that the part-prone structure is certainly the most accepted one. There are several further research avenues within the topic of Hungarian control constructions with overt subjects in their infinitival clauses. Let me present an example here. It would be interesting to examine constructions with sham, neither, and ish two DPs besides the chalk only DP, because if the reason of the differences between partial control predicates and exhaustive control predicates lies in semantic complexity, then there may be significant differences between these constructions as well. And a few words as conclusion. We can see that both the X part and the Lex prompt factors can make statistically significant differences in the acceptability, and my expectations came true partially. And we can see that lexical DPs seem to be less acceptable than pronominal DPs, while in the case of the nature of the predicates, the results are mixed and probably influenced by other factors. And we can also see that there are possible future research avenues within the topic of Hungarian control constructions. And thank you for your attention.